dive in here. Let's dive in.
Let's do
So
it.
I always like to talk to people about their early stuff. So before neo4j, you did Wind. How do you say it? Wind H,
Yeah, wind.
Windh,
Yeah,
Wind.
wind.
So what was it, and what did anything in there help shape your vision? Like, did you discover use cases and stuff that led you to this neo4j thing? Tell me about that.
Yeah. Yeah, so this was the first startup that I worked at, and I didn't found it. I wasn't one of the founders. I joined as an engineer. I was in my late teens or like maybe 20 years old or something like that, right? And so very early on, just maybe my first real job or something like that. And it was you know um, a really small company, but they didn't call themselves a small company. They used this other weird term that I'd never heard. They called themselves a startup, right? And it was doing enterprise content management systems, right? But this was at the time it was called ASP, if you remember that.
Oh
not
yeah, totally. That
not
was .NET
Microsoft
stuff.
ASP.
Oh
No,
no.
no, no, not micro.
Oh
No, 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 not that. Not
oh.
that. That's application service pages or something like
Right,
that,
right.
or application server pages or something.
Yeah,
No, active server pages, I think is what it was. But
yeah.
this ASP was application service provider. In other words,
Oh
what we
yes,
today
yes.
would call SaaS,
Yeah,
right?
yeah. Right, right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So what that meant was that enterprise content management is basically a big file system, right? That you upload your stuff to instead of putting it in your local file server, right? Um, but ASP meant that it was a service that you used your browser to access, right? And this was like, whoa, very weird and revolutionary. This is like Hotmail era.
Yeah.
Salesforce barely existed. This
Right.
is way back in the days, right?
It is, yeah.
And so we built that, and today we will call it a multi-tenant SaaS application, right? Which meant that you logged on and you work at company X. Like as you log on, you would get company X's logo in the top left corner, the colors, right, of company X, that type of thing.
Right,
I
right.
log onto the same system from company Y, and it looks
Yeah.
company Y with our colors, right? So even though it's
Yeah.
served out of the same platform,
Yeah.
it's a multi-tenant solution, right?
Yeah, I
And what
remember
that
this
meant
stuff.
for us technically, right? So I became the CTO of the startup, CTO and VP engineering. And what that meant for us technically was that we had to manage like a really sophisticated set of permissions where Bradford is part of a group that is this company X, but in fact, you were part of a group called, let's call it product marketing, which is then part of another group, let's call it marketing, which is part of company X, which is kind of a tree, right? But then actually, product marketing is a little bit of a weird group because it's part of both the marketing group and the product management group. So actually, all of a sudden, that node in your tree has multiple parents, which for someone like you is mathematically schooled. That's when a tree turns into a graph when you have multiple parents, right? And so we had to model that out, and we were using a normal classic kind of architecture. Three-tier architecture is what people talked about back then, right? So we had a normal relational database, we had a middle layer, and kind of a presentation layer, right? And so we modeled this all out in Oracle and Informix, were kind of our databases of choice back in the days. And we could model out this permission kind of hierarchy slash graph. It was doable, but it's kind of awkward, right? And then when you had to marry that to say that Bradford has write access to this folder, which lives in another folder, right? As write access, and then as a member of product management, you have read access to this other folder. And then you start looking at this and you have to resolve in real time when you try to access like some piece of content. You have to basically calculate what we would mathematically call the transitive closure of both of these graphs and find the overlap, which all of a sudden, if you've modeled this out in a relational database with joins, it was doable, but man, was it painful, right? And so here I am, early 20s. We have a 20-person engineering team. We're VC backed, even though I barely understood. We had some investors. That's all I kind of understood, right? Half of my team is spending the majority of their time fighting with a relational database. And this is shocking to me because even though I was kind of early 20s, I've been programming half my life, right? I've been building a bunch of software, kind of early internet games and stuff like that. In every single project that I've ever had, the database had been an accelerator. It had helped me. It took this big, gnarly, I'm going to store shit on disk, make it, queryable with some programming language, multiple users, concurrent access, guaranteed durable storage, online backups. Like those are big, gnarly problems. Took that all off my plate so I could focus on building my game or solving whatever application I was building, right? But in this case, it was different. And so that's actually that pain we lived through. That was the fertile birthing ground for what we today call the property graph model and neo4j. Because the root cause of all this, we now have a language for as an industry, which is we had a shape of data that was a mismatch. The shape of that data was a mismatch with the abstractions exposed by the relational database, right? The relational database exposed a tabular structure, rows and columns. Great for your payroll, your uniform data, averages, that kind of stuff, right? But I had all these relationships and connections and multiple levels of indirection, and try to squeeze that into those tables was doable, but again, very hard, took very time consuming, and also from a runtime perspective, very slow. So that's kind of the high level summary of kind of my time at that company, and also how that led into what we today call neo4j.
Yeah, and did you start messing with this at Wind or doing an open source project or whatever? Did it tell me about like the sort of actually origin story for the open source project and neo4j as a company? Were they the same?
Yeah, and so what ended up happening was that we, after quite a while, like a year or so, started getting some kind of understanding around why was the database holding us back, right? And then we realized that what we wanted was a database that worked exactly like Oracle. Like I was a big fan of Oracle, the database back then. I still am a big fan of Oracle, the database, by the way. Like I think it's a great relational database. And so I want that, but I just want a different data model. Instead of rows and tables, what if we had nodes and then relationships between those nodes? And the relationship could have a type because, Emil and Bradford are friends or colleagues or married, or like those are different things. So we should have types on the relationships. And you know what? Let's have key value pairs on both the nodes and the relationship. So the Emil node has, key name value Emil, right? And then the relationship friends, it has an age, 10 years, that kind of a thing, right? So if we just had that and everything else is the same, everything feels like Oracle, that's what we wanted. And so we figured we can't be the first people to run into this, right? That doesn't seem plausible. So we started looking around and we just couldn't find anything. We found some people emulating it on top of a relational database, so like exposing an API, right? But we felt like, well, that's a little bit lipstick on a pig type of a thing. We tried that out. It was always very complex. It was always it never performed well, never scaled well. So it's like, all right, that doesn't seem to be the real solution. So ultimately, we came to the conclusion that, you know what, we need to build this ourselves. And we were young enough and naive enough to say, screw it, you know, let's just build it. How hard can it be?
Yeah,
Type of a thing.
right,
And here we are 15 plus years later. It turns out that it is
right.
pretty hard to build a fully ACID transactional, graph database. But
Yeah,
so that was the birth of it all, right? And then we built it all for that startup. That startup then went through the IT bubble,
uh-huh.
flew high, crashed deep,
Mm-hmm.
super painful. I'm a young manager, had to fire all my friends. It was
Right,
like really brutal, right? And I didn't
right.
know what I was doing at all because I'm 23 years old, right? It was like very tough times, but out of that, we ended up building this new database, and we talked about it as, hey, this is bigger than just our company, right? But it didn't feel right for us to convert that company into a database company. And then also, early 2000s, kind of the discourse in our industry wasn't really, it was more like, hey, the relational database, it's like this mathematical axiom underpinning everything else, right? 10 years earlier, the object databases came around, and Larry Ellison killed them with a single keynote at Oracle Open World, right? And wiped out that entire industry. And so no one really talked about the relational database as prime for disruption or anything like that, right? And so we just kept it internal. We just said, hey, you know what? Um, we're gonna be able to build software faster and build faster software because we have this more powerful backend than our competition. So it's our secret sauce, it's our competitive advantage type of a thing, right? So that's kind of how we thought about it. Fast forward a few years, and all of a sudden, Amazon releases this academic article called Dynamo, where they said, hey, you know what? We tried to scale based on Oracle and all the kind of commercial off-the-shelf software, but we just couldn't. Like we're operating at, they probably didn't use the word web scale, but whatever, something like that, right? Massive scale. And so we were forced to build our own database. We call it Dynamo. Here's how it works. And 6 months after that, Google released the big table paper saying, you know what? We're Google. We've also seen some scale. We also were forced to build our own new type of database. Here's how it works. We call it big table, right? And that was this kind of lightning strike in the alpha geek community, which you are a part, right? Where it's like all of a sudden everyone started talking about the death of the relational database and that kind of stuff, right? Hadoop came into the market, and all of a sudden there's like this entire Cambrian explosion of choice and experimentation. And we sat there and it's like, wait, we've built this thing that we've only used internally, that's kind of early, it's kind of beta, but you know what? It works for us. What if we took this and we released it into the world? And honestly, we were like super arrogant about it. We said things like, the world deserves this, and stuff like that, right? And when we, but it was never clear to us that we were gonna start a company around it, right? We were very naive about that. Our initial go-to move was let's open source it in kind of the gold standard, like what we aspire to, what we almost didn't dare to dream of, but what we secretly hoped for was to be accepted as a top-level Apache software foundation project. That is kind of what, and then we figured we'd release it and then, do consulting on the side, like on top of neo4j, right? And that was going to be our lives, right? But then after a while, we started realizing that, you know what? It's a freaking database, right? It's just about as R&D intensive as you can get without building semiconductor factories and stuff like that. So we're like, it'll probably require some amount of full-time engineering. And if we're out consulting on this software that we're releasing for free, well, you know what? There's a way, like capitalism has figured out a way of organizing resources such that you can invest in stuff like this, right? What if we wrapped a company around it? And so then we realized, you know what? Hey, let's try to marry both of these things. Let's release an open source edition of our product, but then let's use an open core model where we also have a commercial edition, and that way we can actually fund full-time, R&D engineers working on building the database.
Yeah, and what's interesting is like you guys are old school. You've been around, for quite some time, and you've seen these kind of, I would characterize as two completely distinct eras of this open core model, right? Because, and you've managed to somehow transcend to the second era, even though you were before the companies that were in the first era, right? So you had the Hadoop guys, like Cloudera and Hortonworks and these guys, which kind of turned out to be, just if we're being candid, pretty shitty businesses, right? Because
totally,
they were basically, the way I talk about this is like that was actually just a window left open by IBM's incompetence, right? Like IBM incompetently whiffed on like big data and then AI and then blockchain. They kind of whiff on everything, right? They kind of miss it and then they come in later with a bunch of nonsense. And so, but they're like, nowadays they're like this large scale tech services player, right? And they missed that opportunity in big data and left the door open to all these like Hadoop consulting shops, which Cloudera and Hortonworks and so on kind of filled. I'd put Palantir in that bucket too. They're basically just a glorified Hadoop consultancy, but they actually owned it. That's what they did, and they did a way better job, I think, of productizing their services, and they made more money. But anyhow, you had this first wave. They kind of have a mediocre services businesses. And then you have the second wave. One of the guys I had on to interview early on here was Jay Krebs from Confluent. He's a friend of mine. And, they IPO'd and became like a $15 billion company, right? And then Databricks became like whatever, a $25 billion company. So you have these guys, basically they're running the thing hosted. All of a sudden it's worth 20 bill, right? And it's like, whoa, this is a pretty big change. And you guys have been kind of like, petering along like the whole time and somehow came to this new model, even though you predated those Hadoop companies. So I'm real curious to just hear about your journey and how you managed to get to this point, because this wasn't obvious when you started, right? And like the way you're talking about things and kind of having this open source project, wrapping a company around it, and like kind of somehow navigating to where you are now must have been pretty interesting path. I can't think of another company like it that's been around through those eras and has like come to a modern model now. So I'd love to hear about this story a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of aspects to it, obviously. I think like clearly a high order bit is actually one of, let's call it licensing and product editions, right?
Yeah.
Which is kind of this geeky topic that open source founders like myself can spend hours and hours debating and exploring nuances of, and I'm not going to go into kind of all of that, but suffice to say that when you choose an open source business model, it's actually not a business model arguably, but like let's call it an open source company where a big part of what you build is available for free under an open source license, right?
Yeah.
What specific license you choose and how you differentiate how you differentiate your product editions, it's actually a very strategic choice. But most open source companies, they make that decision super early on by a technical, usually apolitical and non-business savvy founder, right? Who makes that decision on fairly arbitrary kind of grounds. It could be things like, I choose the GPL because it's the most popular license. Or I choose the Apache license because I'm in Java and most libraries that I see are Apache license. It could be stuff like that, right? But that decision coupled with whichever way you float features into your product editions will in many ways control the long arc of your company. And we made a ton of mistakes along the way. This is not one of them, though. We were thoughtful about this particular piece where we said, you know what? We're going to have a community edition, which is GPL, right? Which gives us this distribution advantage of being open source, right? And matched with an enterprise edition, which is initially AGPL and then closed source, right? Which means that one of the cloud platforms. So first, that means that you can convert people who use your community edition into actual customers, right?
Yep.
So that's obviously important. And the knock-on effect is that it also becomes very challenging for one of the cloud platforms to adopt your product, right? And so the combination of the licensing choice that we made and how we chose to differentiate those editions, where we have a very powerful enterprise edition, right? Another way of saying that is that we could have made the community edition more powerful, right? But one of the consequences of that is that we've controlled our own destiny over the long term, right?
Right.
Because you mentioned the Hadoop vendors. We could spend an entire episode talking about what went wrong there. Some things went right, but a lot of things went wrong from a product surface perspective, from a architecture perspective, from a business model perspective. There's so many things that are interesting, about that, right? But one of the reasons that we've been able to do this has been just this ability to control what's in our community edition versus what's in our enterprise edition.
Interesting. And so are you guys running your own hosted solution now? Is that like,
Yeah.
and is that where the majority of the revenue comes from now?
Yeah. So
Okay.
I think
Yeah.
what's emerged now in the last few years is like kind of this blueprint for, let's call it the B2D, like startup business to developer, or like a
Yeah.
kind of a
Right.
developer first go to market,
Right.
something like that, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Where it's like you build a self-managed piece of software, right, which is still right for many, not all, but many types of products today, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because
Mm-hmm.
kind of enterprises run on data centers, but developers run on laptops, type of a
Yep.
thing.
Yep.
Developers love to have a local experience, right? So you
Mm-hmm.
build that, you have a community edition that you get distribution through that. You have an open core edition for monetizing people on the self-managed, right, who wants to run it in their own data centers. You monetize that through like a closed source open core and enterprise edition, right?
Mm-hmm.
But then the primary thrust is your service offering, your cloud offering, right? And so we have that. It's the equivalent of Atlas for MongoDB. We call it
Mm-hmm.
Aura, AURA. So
Mm-hmm.
this is neo4j Aura. It's a
Mm-hmm.
fully managed cloud offering available on all the three major clouds. We have a free tier, right? That's the spiritual sibling to the community edition in the
Mm-hmm.
self-managed world, right? The free
Mm-hmm.
tier. You can
Mm-hmm.
sign up completely for free. You don't even have to swipe your credit card. And there is some limitations, obviously, right? X amount of capacity. Nodes and relationships is what we measure on. And then you have we call it Aura Professional. This is the self-service, swipe your credit card. You're a small startup. You start at $50 per month type of a thing. And then you scale with increasing usage from there, all the way to the Aura DB Enterprise Edition, right? So Enterprise tier, which
Mm-hmm.
is the fully managed enterprise mission critical workloads. It has all the bells and whistles, private link, VPC, SSO integration, SOC 2 Type 2 compliance, all that kind of stuff that if you're a big bank, you need that for your mission critical workloads, right? So the full spectrum is now available as a managed service, and
Mm-hmm.
then the equivalent of that, on the self-managed. And I think that's the blueprint you mentioned, Jay, from Confluent. If you look at
Right. Yeah.
Confluent,
Yeah. Totally.
Elastic, MongoDB, so this is kind of the blueprint that is emerging for our type of companies.
Right. It ends up being that like way you started and evolved the business has become this. It's right in the sweet spot of this go to market approach, right? Like as the world has realized that the classical way of doing enterprise marketing and sales is pretty expensive. This kind of product led growth or organic community oriented way of generating leads is a super valuable asset, right? So for those
Yeah,
who
it's
have that at the core, it's incredible.
totally. It's generating leads. That's one part, but there's also the moat around the business,
It's a
right?
huge
If you think
moat.
about,
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah, if you think about, there's this big crossroads when you have infrastructure software companies, ISVs
Mm-hmm.
like neo4j or a Mongo or Elastic or something like
Mm-hmm.
that, right? There's a huge kind of fork like in the road upstream, which is, can one of the cloud platforms take your product and operate it as their own, right?
Right.
So when Amazon enters into your product category, and what I usually say is that there's only two certainties in life, right? One is we're all going to die, right? And the second one is we're all going to compete with Jeff Bezos eventually.
Yeah.
Um, and I'm not even sure about the former, by the
Yeah.
way,
Yeah.
um,
They're working on
but
that, but
yeah,
yeah.
exactly, right.
Right. In
But
fact,
like
Jeff
when they
Bezos is probably working on that,
exactly, that's
right?
probably one of the things
Yeah.
he's working on, right? But like when Amazon does enter into your category, right, that can genuinely be good news versus bad news, right? Like for us, we've chosen a category creation go to market play, right? So we
Yeah.
coined the term graph database, as you probably know, right? And we popularized that term and evangelized it. And what success looks like is you get competition. That is what
Yeah.
success looks like with that one, right? So when Amazon enters into your category, right, yeah, every founder will say, oh, this validates our category, great news. And then privately, they're like, damn it, holy shit, what am
Yeah.
I going to do, right?
Right.
When you have
Totally.
category creation, that
Totally.
genuinely is accurate. That is what you want with category creation, right? You want to get that validation. But if they enter into your category with your own product, which is a unique challenge for specifically open source companies, right? You're in for a world of pain. Ask those Hadoop vendors
Right.
you mentioned
Right.
before, or for that matter, Elastic or someone like that, right?
Totally. Yeah.
And
So tell
and
me,
so
sorry, finish your thought. Finish your thought.
no, and so then just going full circle on kind of that developer go to market, that community being a source of lead gen, that is completely accurate. But if you
Yeah.
look at a company like neo4j or MongoDB, right, a huge part of the moat here is the fact that they can't enter into our category with our own product, and then B, the rich developer community around the company.
Exactly. So I want to talk about just like fundamentally the the elevator pitch for a graph database, because I think, as you mentioned in the beginning, um, a lot of people have sort of built little API layers on top of a relational store or a key value store or whatever for doing this, right? Um, and I think a lot of people have not even used a graph database. I remember fiddling with neo4j a bunch, like way back in the very early years with you guys. But then I think we actually tried to use it on Prismatic at one point. I think we ended up hand rolling some stuff on top of a we had, I think, a couple of different ways of doing it, on top of key value stuff and on top of relational stuff. And I think it's a real challenge, I'm sure, that you guys have had, right? Where a lot of people have hand rolled different things, and there's certain use cases where it's probably fine. It's probably fine to do that. And then there's other use cases where it's like, no, that actually really sucks. So I'm kind of curious to hear your elevator pitch for like, why graph databases? Why not roll something on top of relational or key value? And like, when is it really the sort of sweet spot where you really nail it, and like doing something else is really shitty, and this is just like absolutely way better, no questions asked, like clearly you should do it this way?
Yeah, it's a super interesting question, right? So actually unpacking it, I think it's actually two parts to your question. One is, what's the value of using graphs, or let's talk about it as relationships in your data for a specific use case. That's kind of one. And then the second part of your question is like, how do you best deliver on that capability? Is it a native graph database, or is it a layer on top of an existing relational or key value store, or something like that, right? So if I start with the first part, right? So the fundamental value prop of a graph database is, you know what? It turns out that we're living in an increasingly connected world, right? Every day, like here we sit, you're in the East Bay of San Francisco, I'm in Malmö, Sweden, right? And we're on this multi-way call, right? I'm carrying multiple phones in my pockets. I have AirPods. Everything's just becoming more and more connected, right? That's hardly a controversial statement, right? But if you think about the consequences of data, right, for an increase in the connected world, what is data actually, right? You founded a VC from DCVC Data Collective, right? Like, what is data actually? Well, you know what? Data is a digital representation of the physical world. It's a way of describing the world, right, in digital form. And so as the world is becoming more connected, data is becoming more and more connected. And connections in data exert a huge amount of pressure on a relational database. If we just go back to the fundamental and talk about the relational database, this is how when you want to model how things fit together, right? A supply chain, for example, right? From point A to point B to point C, and then we deliver it to our stores, right? You want to model that connected data structure, you have to use joins. And joins are really powerful. Joins are not bad. They're amazing. It's arguably actually the most powerful fundamental operation in a relational database, but it's very expensive, computationally expensive, and it's exponentially expensive. So you do two, you do three, you do four, and all of a sudden you're talking in non-trivial data sets, seconds, Pretty soon you're talking minutes and hours, right? And so then you start thinking about my supply chain example. 10, 15 years ago, if I went to any manufacturer, anyone who's producing physical goods, they might have a supply chain that is 2, 3 levels deep, right? Today, fast forward to 2022, right? 2023, I guess, when this is being released, right? Then any company that is producing stuff is tapping into this global fine grained mesh spanning continent to continent. And all of a sudden, there's a drunken captain that blocks the Suez Canal for a week, if you recall that. I think, was that
Oh yeah.
2021 or
Right.
2020? I don't even remember.
Right.
Like,
I
there's a
remember the
block for a week.
memes. I remember the
Yeah.
memes.
And it's like
Yeah.
the entire global supply chain just got clogged up in that, right? And
Mm-hmm.
then in order to analyze and figure out, hey, how is this going to impact my business, right? You have to digitalize your supply chain. And you're not talking 2, 3 levels deep. Now we're talking 20, 30 levels deep. If you want to try to make sense of that, you have to use a graph database. Your relational database, it's going to be just churning away for hours at end, right? And so when you have use cases, when how things fit together is really valuable, that's when a graph database shines. So this is real-time recommendations, right? You and me, how are you and I connected through our common purchase patterns? You build up a digital twin of any kind of retail business or other type of business. Great use case for graph databases. Fraud detection, fantastic use case for us. Knowledge graphs, identity and access management, customer 360. You go down the list of the classic kind of graph database use cases, but the fundamental kind of data pattern to it is how things fit together,
Right.
multiple layers down, right?
And do
So that's kind
and
of the
do they have to do this? Is it about the sort of real time or on demand nature that makes you want to use a graph database? Because, for example, I know, in the social network world, which seems like, I mean, it is all this. I think they end up not using graph databases as much as you would think, and the reason why is that is actually just speed demand. So everything ends up with this super gnarly like pre-computation paradigm, right? Everything gets pre-computed and duplicated, right? So there's massive amount of data duplication and pre-computation in order to like serve up all these news feeds super fast, or like you click on, you try to go through the graph of your social network and see who's following who and all this stuff. It's like everything is like pre-computed and cached to the nines, right? Because that's the only way you're going to make this stuff fast enough. So is that, would you agree with that? Is that the case that they end up doing that? Whereas like if you need to do something on demand, that's where the graph database really shines.
Yes, I would agree with that. Like the real-time nature and in particular like a mixed read-write workload
Yeah.
in real time,
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
is
Yeah.
really kind of the sweet
That makes
spot, like the
sense.
the
Yeah.
must-have kind of in the quadrant. Now,
You can't
even
weasel out
for
of it by pre-computing everything in that case, right?
exactly,
Yeah.
right? Now, even in the stuff where, in your words, you can weasel your way out of it with pre-compute, um, that's usually a more awkward surface for the developer, right?
Yeah,
So
totally.
if you can solve it with an existing graph database, that's just a lot more convenient, right? Now, if you're Facebook scale and you were started in 2005, you will have invented your own thing. They happen to call their own in-memory graph layer tau, right?
Yeah.
Which is petabytes and petabytes of RAM because
Yeah.
it's meta wallets, right? So they can afford,
Right.
that kind of stuff, right?
Yeah.
But generally, what you said is right. And getting then to the kind of the second part of your question, right? What ends up happening, we see exactly what you said, which is people do some of these point solutions where they duplicate it in memory, they store it in some other database, and they try to build some kind of replicated in memory version of the graph.
Right.
And sometimes they pre-compute it and duplicate it, which is another way of doing denormalization,
Mm-hmm.
right? Basically, right? So we see that, right? And it's typically point solutions.
Mm-hmm.
What no one has been able to do at scale is take an existing database, build a layer on top of that, and offer that as a generic graph database product or service, right?
Mm-hmm.
Data stacks tried that. This is the company behind Apache Cassandra. They tried that with various versions, DSC graph. It used to be called Titan and Janus graph, which was a layer on top of Cassandra or HBase, right? They tried that. It could never scale beyond 2-3 hops because that was as much as they could pre-compute, right? So that never took off. Microsoft tried that with Cosmos DB, which used to be an amazingly strong, actually the best document database that I know of, including Mongo, right? Used to be this Azure, it was called Azure Document DB. They rebranded it as Cosmos, added a layer of graph on top of it, right? Completely abysmal performance and scalability, and no one is using it for that. So every single company that has tried to add a graph layer on top of their existing database have ultimately failed, right?
Yeah,
and that's because
makes sense.
It's so much more powerful if you own the entire stack. You can optimize your storage engine, your transaction manager, your query planner, everything, your entire stack for connected data, which is ultimately where you get all the performance, the scalability, and really importantly, all the reliability and data durability benefits.
Right. That makes sense because that piece of it's super gnarly with connected data compared to a lot of other types of data. So given you guys have been around so long, I'm guessing that maybe you hit some kind of inflection point, or maybe it has been like slow, steady growth the entire time. I don't know. Like, did you see periods of change where you really saw like big acceleration and growth? And then like, how do you see this in the next 5-10 years? Like, what do you see the big future like use cases and areas of growth? I want to hear about the sort of backward and forward looking growth story a little bit.
Yeah, so a little bit of kind of inflection points in the past. We've actually had a very similar story to MongoDB. Like if you look at MongoDB, right, we're a private company, right? So we're not talking about our numbers. We did announce that we crossed 100 million ARR last year. So we've done kind of some of those kind of spot announcements.
Congratulations, that's pretty hard to do.
Yeah,
so.
Thank you. Thank you. It's kind of interesting, actually, since we've talked a lot about the past, before I get back to the Mongo analogy. There's like over 350 databases tracked on DB engines that were born out of that Cambrian explosion in the late 2000s, right?
Yeah.
Over 100 of them raised money, over 50 institutional VC capital. 5 have crossed 100 million ARR, right? Mongo, Couchbase Data Stacks, Redis, and neo4j, right? That's it, right?
Redis, so I haven't heard about Redis in years. I forgot about Redis.
Exactly, right? Yeah. But coming back to kind of inflection points in the past, or kind of in our growth curve. So we've had that very same 50+% steady growth that Mongo exhibited for years, right? You know, and when they went public in 2017, right, with about 150 million ARR, right? And you could track back 3 years past, 50+% growth very steadily, right? That is exactly our numbers. It's like this very steady, never the hyper growth that you see with the analytical databases, right? The Snowflakes and the Databricks of the world. And the reason for that is that you don't see that on the OLTP databases, the operational data stores, for reasons of friction of adoption. Like when you adopt an operational data stores, it's a capital B, capital D decision, right?
Yeah.
Like that's the backend for your entire thing, right? The system of record for your application, right? That's a big decision, so much more friction.
Yeah.
On the analytical data store, it's much easier to spin that up. It's a low consideration decision. You spin it up, you put some data in there, you get some analytics back out from it. If it's valuable, you keep using it, right? And so you have more explosive growth. On the flip side, you have a higher churn, right?
Yes.
On the operational side, it's not growing as fast. It's still strong growth, but it's steady because it's executing it against the biggest market in all of enterprise software, which is the database market, right? And so when you have growth like that, it's never like the inflection point is much more a perception on the outside. Because you grow 50% at, I'm making numbers up, at 25 million. It's kind of good, but not really great. You grow 50% at 100 million. That's best in class. All of a sudden. Right?
Yeah, totally.
And then you do that with the stickiness of a database category. Right? That's all of a sudden very, very interesting, right? So it's one of those things where kind of exponential growth looks linear in the beginning, like from the outside, that type of a thing, right? So I think that's a big part of it.
And you're just not hearing about it because you guys are down in the boiler room, like making shit work at
Exactly.
the infrastructure
Yeah.
layer.
Look,
Yeah.
I bet every single person who's listening to this podcast have used neo4j this week, right? You go to any, if you're using cash in the US, any ATM, 20, every single one of the 20 biggest banks in North America are using neo4j today. 99% of all airfare calculations, how do I fly from SFO to Copenhagen? 99% of that is using Neo4j. Every single time you booked a room with any Marriott property, so Marriott, Starwood, Ritz Carlton, you've used Neo4j, right? It's just that, to your point, it's a back end technology, so no one knows about it.
Yeah, yeah. It's buried in the infrastructure layer, and we don't hear about it that much until all of a sudden people are like, "Whoa, that thing's huge." I actually didn't even notice, when I was going through my friends to set up the interviews for this pod. That was the first time I honestly noticed how big you guys had gotten. Really, because it's been very like stealthy in the sense that I don't see a lot of like pomp and circumstance and stuff. Frankly, that's probably good. I think a lot of people who put a lot of energy into that and attract too much attention to themselves when it's not really due, like, and end up doing themselves like a disservice, because there's always a low that comes after every high, right? That's like the nature
Yeah,
of the
that's for
of the
sure.
world. So it
No,
can be
yeah, I
pretty
couldn't
bad.
agree more. And we're very kind of engineering-y and very Swedish when it comes to stuff like that, right? And
Yeah,
that we lead with substance and we lead with product. Now, having
right,
said that, like the fact that we raised the largest round in database history
right.
last year,
Yeah,
right? That was
huge.
meaningful. A lot of people kind of that raised a lot of eyebrows. And then we announced the 100 million crossing $100 million. That ended up being actually meaningful. So we probably could do a little bit more of that, to be
Yeah,
honest. But
yeah,
at our core DNA, we're still kind of just, hey, let's build great product that solve
yeah,
real customer problems,
yeah.
and that's kind of what gives us
And
energy.
I think, honestly though, man, I'm a long-term business builder, and the when the cycles are down like they are now is when people start remembering and respecting like the difficulty of building a real business and not overhyping everything and doing a lot of this bullshit. And so, I think maybe a lot of things, in hindsight seem wise that maybe felt a little bit like, man, we should be getting more attention or whatever. But I think now it's it's better to not try to shine the limelight on yourself like too much, in particular if you're not having challenges with customer acquisition or with recruiting or whatever, right? It's like I always think of stuff that way as a CEO, is like, if I'm going to shine a spotlight on myself, I need to know why, right? Like if I need to hire people or I need to like bring in customers or whatever, like whatever, I'll get up on stage, I'll do whatever I have to do, but I'm not going up there just to make myself feel good about myself or like
Just for
be
the
cool
vanity of it all.
or whatever, right? I really don't give a shit about any of that. I only care about the outcomes based stuff. And so it's like I think,
Totally.
people are starting to respect that as we go into more real business building mode. And so, playing the long game like that, I think is smart. And then now you guys are in a real position where doing more of that over time makes sense, and you're shining a spotlight on something really beefy. So you have a lot to talk about, right? Like you're never going to be in a position where you kind of got out ahead of your skis, which I think is really respectable. So, like, that said, you did raise a lot. You kind of, the growth has been slow and steady, but the capital raising has been sort of like backloaded in a way, right? Were you pretty lean for a long time? Like, do you feel like you ran the company intentionally lean? And like, tell me about that journey, because it wasn't until way later that you've raised a ton of capital, right?
Yeah, and so we've always had a very long-term view on this. Where like I have the best job in the world. Like I love to do what I do. And I would love to be the CEO of this company 10 years from now, 20 years from now. I think we're doing something really, really meaningful. There's now 20 independent projects that use Neo4j to find the cure for cancer, which is just like this amazingly humbling thing. We were the back end for the Panama Papers, which identified a bunch of offshore tax fraud, and several prime ministers in the world had to resign because of the findings, you know, in that. NASA is publicly on the record saying that thanks to neo4j, humanity is going to get to Mars 2 years earlier, right? Like that type of impact, it's just like, it's so humbling and so inspiring. So we're in it for the long, and for the long run, for the long term, right? And and it's a category creation play. And it took a while for the world to catch up. And then I mentioned before, I was kind of patting myself on the back about all the thoughtful, super strategic, like licensing decisions that we made before, right? And I am proud of some of those decisions, but everything is a trade-off. And one of the trade-offs that we made was, you know what? By virtue of having a very powerful enterprise edition, yes, that means that the cloud platforms can take it and compete against us. Yes, that means we're going to convert more customers. So that's great for building a long term company. But if we poured all those features into our community edition, we would have gotten much bigger developer adoption, right? And this is what someone like Mongo did, or a generation before us, um, MySQL did, right? And then all of a sudden, you get a much higher degree of popularity and awareness and buzz. And all of a sudden, people start adopting your software for all kinds of new use cases, right? And so that creates the market faster in kind of in terms of mind share, arguably not in terms of dollars, right? Which is what will matter to you as a public company in the end, right? Um, but so that was a drawback of some of those supposedly wise decisions that I talked about before, right? That the way we structured, we got less developer adoption, right? Now, so what that meant was that it took a while for the world to start realizing just how broadly applicable graph databases are, right? And so once the world started catching up to that, and now we have Gartner saying things like, in 2021, 10% of data and analytics innovation was backed by graph technology. And they're projecting by 2025, that's going to be 80%.
Wow.
80% of all innovation
That's a
in data
huge
and
swing.
analytics will be backed by graph technology, right?
Yeah.
This is Gartner saying that, the
Yeah.
masters at predicting the present, right?
Right.
So
Yeah.
like when they say that, like it's wow, it's really
It's
arrived, right?
it's already
Um,
happened. Yeah.
yeah,
Right.
exactly, right?
Yeah.
And so that was this big leading indicator or enabler for us to say, you know what? Now it's time to start accelerating. We raise the big capital so that we can really start investing to win the market.
Yeah. So one before I forget, I wanted to ask this a little earlier, but whatever. It's a fun conversation. The You guys have been around so long on the JVM. I'm assuming you might have had to do some like big gnarly rewrites or something like that along the way, right? Because the Java and the whole JVM ecosystem is like radically more advanced than it was back in the day. So, have there been a few of these or whatever? Is there any just little bit you can give us about how you've had to change and evolve over time? And is it even still all written in Java? Have you played around with some of the other languages maybe on the JVM or something over time?
So it's all of the JVM. It's all of the JVM with an asterisk that I'll get back to.
Okay.
It's all in the JVM. It's a multitude of languages between Java, the programming language, and Scala and others
Mm-hmm.
as well,
I knew there
right?
was going to be some
Uh,
Scala in there because you got a hat tip to the
of
Swedes.
course,
So
yeah, exactly, right. Um, but yeah, there's been a constant investment in various ways of exploring the low level functionality of the JVM. In fact, just outside this wall right here is the kernel team here in Malmö, Sweden. So it's like about a dozen people who's like obsessing over low level JVM internals, type stuff. So for example, we use all kind of off heap storage, right? That we manage ourselves, and this depends on how technical your audience is, but like part of the promise of Java and running on a runtime, right, on a virtual machine, was you don't have to do manual memory management. And I know you've spent a lot of time in C++
Oh
back in
yeah.
the days, right?
Yeah,
Where,
yeah, yeah.
or C for that matter, like where it's like
Yeah.
malloc. It's like all these manual ways. I'm going to grab this memory now
Yeah.
manually, and then as the developer, I have to keep track of that memory and then free it back out, right? Release
Mm-hmm.
it back out. And Java took that all off the table, which is
Mm-hmm.
great if you're building an application. Fantastic developer productivity benefit. For us down in the engine room, that's not great, right? As a database, we want to own all that, right? And so you could argue that like we've reinvented kind of all those C primitives, right, on top of the JVM, right? But so the short summary of what you're saying is that we've done a ton of investment here, re-implemented it several times over and over again, and ultimately, I think we're very happy with our choice to be on the JVM. You can never fully A/B test something like this, but I don't think it's been a key thing holding us back. For a while, it looked kind of a little bit dicey, right? Because memory management was so gnarly on the JVM. But then collectively, I think as an industry, we figured out how to do that in a more manual and scalable way, which takes more developer overhead, but ultimately works at massive scale for these big systems.
So you have also used some other JVM languages for some parts of it too, it sounds like,
Yes,
which is
yes,
cool.
yeah.
Nice. And so you've separated, I'm assuming, sort of different teams. So you have some people working down at like deep kernel level, like manual memory management stuff on your own set of like primitives and Java and so on that you guys have developed.
That's
And then,
yeah, that's exactly right.
okay, cool,
And
cool.
then
I
and then we
like it.
try to have autonomous teams, right, where they can choose their programming language, like within reason,
Mm-hmm.
right, and that kind of stuff. So that's exactly
And
right.
have you? So is your so the go to market is it just all community oriented? Have you at some point started doing having like an enterprise sales team and enterprise marketing and stuff like that? I'm sure you're doing stuff like this at this point. Like
Yeah,
how has this
this
evolved?
is like yeah, this is a very important and exciting part. It's easy to get kind of down in the weeds of the JVM primitives and malloc and stuff like that. But man, in terms of controlling the long term arc of the company, this is really important, right? So we're a developer first startup, right, in our go to market. And when I say developer first, it's actually practitioner first because there's an entire new leg emerging with neo4j that is targeting data scientists, which is like super exciting. And you asked before about kind of future growth, and I only talked about the historical stuff, but that's a big part of that. But let's put a pin in that for a moment. So developer first, which really is practitioner first, right? If you think about kind of classically how we've gone to market, it's been win the hearts and minds of developers everywhere, right? And this is community edition, download for free, our Aura free tier, sign up, use that, don't charge a dime. We're not making any money out of it. Meetups, pizza and beer, all of that kind of stuff, right? And becomes a little bit weird in terms of pandemic times, but the last full pre-pandemic year, 2019, we had over 500 events about Neo4j. 500 events. So you think about that, right? That's twice, almost two events per working day, right? And and that's not because we had a 100-person event team, right? Like we organized, I have no idea, maybe 50 of them or 100 of them or something like that, right? The rest was just community. It's some person in Jakarta who throws a meetup wherever we have a new release of our product, that kind of stuff, right? And so that's kind of the core of it, right? And then, however, what do we monetize? We have a classic enterprise sales monetization strategy. So what this means is, you know, big, seasoned, experienced enterprise sales reps paired up with a dedicated sales engineer because it's a highly complex sale, selling into the global 2000, landing deal size of hundreds of thousands of dollars of ACV, annual contract value, recurring revenue, right? And so just think about what that means. That is, if they're paying hundreds of thousands of dollars for the database, that means the project in and of itself is probably millions of dollars, which means the ROI has to be tens of millions of dollars, right? So that type of a thing, right? So in other words, we win the hearts and minds of developers, right? They learn in their free time, their spare time, evenings and weekends, to use Neo4j, play around with it, knows what kind of problems it solves. And then the next day, they wake up and they work at Bank of America or British Telecom or AbbVie or like some big company, right? And they're tasked on a project where they realize that, you know what? We have graph shaped data here. Why are we trying to squeeze that into a relational database? I played around with neo4j yesterday, last week, last month, last year, right? Whatever it might be. And I love that experience. It was so much fun, so productive. Let's see if that might be a good fit. They pick up the phone, they call us, and from then on, it's classic enterprise sales, right? But the really important thing here, and this is a huge part of, I think, building ultimately a sustainable and successful go-to-market for infrastructure startup, is 85%, in our case, 85% of all big enterprise deals start with an individual technical champion, start with a developer. And why that is important is that it aligns the company, the long term and the short term of the company, those incentives are aligned. So in other words, we never have to do an argument of, hey, we invest in our community, we invest in developer relations instead of short-term ARR, instead of short-term revenue. No. The smartest way for us to get that is by loving developers, loving practitioners, growing that community, right? And every single situation I've seen with companies where it's two different things, they build a community and then they monetize separately, has ultimately fallen apart, where the community becomes the stepchild, the secondary thing, or something like that. Even with all the best intents, even with founder-led businesses whose heart is all in that, it's just the everyday pressure of quarter to quarter, which ultimately is where you end up as a even private but for sure public company, right? People have to optimize for that short term. So aligning the short term and the long term has been like a core part, I think, of our success to date in our go to market.
Yeah, I think, just digging into this a little bit, it's so important when we talk about enterprise go to market and sort of this idea that the community is just generating leads. It's much more than that, right? Because let's say you want to crack the top 20 banks. You know who the top 20 banks are. It's not difficult to find it out.
Yeah.
You can stick an enterprise sales team on those accounts, and they're going to have to map out all the key stakeholders, all the different groups, like all the places, oh, we know we do stuff in fraud. Like, let's go find who wants fraud. There's a lot of fucking work to map all that out. A lot of fucking work. And then the stakeholders are changing all the time. There's reorgs all the time. This guy who we just spent 6 months ago, now he works over at Citibank now. That fucks everything up. It's a huge cluster, right? When you do that top-down enterprise approach, mapping all this shit out. So when you have a situation where the community is just generating buzz around a new piece of technology or something, that's cool, and it'll help you. It'll reduce sales friction. But that's not the same as when like your case, when you have a developer who's really getting it, they understand where it should be used, and they've brought it in as an idea for a particular project. And now you're bottom up, having that person telling their manager and initiating effectively this enterprise sales machinery that didn't have to do all this shit because the developer is the one who did it. So it's not just that they've thrown a lead over the wall to you. They've brought you in to a very particular use case project, a team, everything, right? So you're skipping all this like map the org, this sort of like breadth first approach where you have to layer by layer map everything out, right? And it's sort of this bottom up depth first approach where like you're going way down to a particular use case and then all the way back up. Now you're building out the sales process around that. You execute, build a case study around it within the organization. Now everybody else can look and see, oh, look what these guys did over here with this neo4j thing. That's pretty sweet. Like, we should be doing that over here too. So when you understand how organizational dynamics work in these big companies and how complicated real enterprise sales is for these larger deals, and you've watched many of these companies be built the way that I have, you come to appreciate there's an enormous economic and speed advantage that accrues to a player that has something like you guys have, where that technical champion is bringing in to a real project. And they've already done all this pre-work, right? Because this is, I mean, people come up with in companies I've done in the past, we've had come up with crazy special workshops where you like get together, certain stakeholders and do this accelerated like POC as a workshop type thing for one day, and then to show the value, and then come back and do like a readout of the results to management and all this shit. You skip all of it. You don't have to do any of that, because you've cultivated the community. The community has gotten a person to get it, and then to see the use case inside their own company, and then they're the ones who bring you in, and that's just awesome. Like, it's just saved
Yeah.
so much bullshit. Like, yeah,
It's really powerful. Now, what if you take that go to market motion and you combine it with an ability in the organization to address different altitudes in the enterprise, inside of the customer base, that's when it can become magical, right? And so if you think about kind of like an enterprise as a pyramid with 3 layers into it, what we've talked about now is the practitioner level. This is the individual technical champion, data scientist, or developer. Then the mid part of the pyramid, that would be the person sitting inside of the IT org, who is like a development manager or director of IT, owns a class of business problems from an IT and a technical delivery perspective, right? And those you want to address with a use case message, right? The base of the pyramid, that's when you talk about what I said in the beginning, which is you don't want to do joins, and this is the value of the intuitiveness, agility, and the flexibility of the graph data model, like that kind of stuff, right? That speaks to the practitioner. But then the mid level, you hit them with a use case and you say, you know what? Other companies that look like you, they've used neo4j to capture fraud rings, right? Dear director of risk at like this global bank, can you capture fraud rings with existing fraud software? It's like, no, we actually can't. Well, with a graph database, you can, and you should see 3 to 5% more fraud captured if you can capture these fraud rings. Oh, that's amazing. So you can hit them with that value message, right? And then the last altitude, that's kind of the C-suite, where you say, hey, you know what, dear big CIO level type at this brick and mortar enterprise, you really have to become a software company or a data driven company. And you know what? The technology that underpins Google is graph based. We can give you that, right? In a little box. And then all of a sudden you can implement this product and that product and that product and become a more data driven enterprise, right?
yeah,
If you can all articulate that at these different 3 levels of altitude, that's really magical. That's what we
yeah,
found.
yeah. That's awesome, because you can sort of expand bottom up really efficiently by not just relying on another developer to pull you into another use case. Like, you're in there, and
You
now
want
you can
both.
pitch the higher ups. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
And you
yeah.
want to
If it's all
unlock bigger
working.
budgets by
Yeah,
doing that, right? Because you don't want to be stuck negotiating the price with a developer because they don't have any budget authority. You
right.
want to
Yeah,
go at
totally.
least one level up for that, right?
Totally. So tell me, with COVID and all the tech downturn and everything in the past couple years, has it affected you a lot? Have you guys had to do layoffs or anything? Have you had to do maybe some belt tightening or replanning, just kind of completely replan the next year or two? Or tell me how it's affected you.
Yeah. And we look here like a lot of tech companies, I think, which is, COVID hit and kind of we all panicked, or at least became very cautious, right? We never did any layoffs or anything like that, but we certainly pulled the brakes on everything, hiring freeze and all that kind of stuff, in Q2 of 2020. And then lo and behold, wait, what do you mean the metrics are better? Like, wait, why does everything look faster? Like, why is the pipeline so rich? And like, well, okay, man, we better start hiring, right? And so like all of that stuff, right? And some version of the pandemic accelerated not all trends as it turned out, but many trends, and we certainly were the beneficiaries of that. right? And like many technology companies. Obviously, now we're recording this in November of 2022, and I think by the time this goes live in early 2023, we're probably going to know more about kind of the impending recession. Things certainly are looking a lot more dire from a macroeconomic perspective between whatever Fed raising rates on one hand and inflation on the other hand, and geopolitics and like war in Europe and supply chain disruption, and you add this all up together, it certainly looks like a worrying cocktail as I'm sitting here in November of 2022, and like everyone else, we're taking a cautious stance, feeling very, very, very lucky that we raised money in in summer of 2021, which was kind of the peak of the peak of the peak. So we have a really strong balance sheet. We have years and years of runway. We don't have to raise money probably ever again, right, until we go public, right? But certainly not in the next couple of years with this probably impending recession. But I'm certainly taking a much more cautious and conservative stance today than if we had spoken 6 months ago.
Yeah, but you feel like everything has kind of been incrementally baked into all of your planning and stuff. You haven't.
Now it has not, like
Yeah.
if you look back 12 months ago, it certainly looked a lot, like
Yeah.
things were going to move much faster, right?
It sounds like
no,
just in
certainly not.
general. It sounds like just in general, you have taken a bit more of a steady and level-headed approach, because I do know a number of my friends that are CEOs that got really swept up at the end of the cycle. And I think a lot of people don't understand the pressure that gets put onto CEOs by their boards if they don't have, in my opinion, good boards. I think a lot of VCs they just don't think from first principles at all. It's all pattern matching and what's happening and social proof and so on around them. And so I have many friends that they hired a shitload more people than they should have, and they didn't even know why, and they couldn't tell me why at the time. I remember talking to a few friends, and they're, hey, we're increasing the sales staff by 50% in the next 2 quarters, and I'm just sitting there saying, fuck, dude, are you sure you want to do that? Like, and they're like, yeah, I'm not even sure that we're really nailing the motion yet, and so on. And I'm like, yeah, but then why the fuck are you doing this, right? And just like all the other people in the peer group are doing it, and like I just can't get the board off my back. Like, we just have to do it. So we raised all this money and we're hiring all these people. And I'm like, dude, that's not how you fucking make good business decisions. What are you doing? Like, and these are people who that's out of character for them, right? And so I think like at the end of the cycle, a lot of people lost their grounding and like even strayed from their roots of rationality. And these are former technical, pretty principled, like rigorous thinking folks that really like lost their marbles at the end of the cycle and really like allowed people to pressure them into shit that they didn't even think was a good idea, or even really pause to question whether they should think it's a good idea. They just kind of went with it. And of course, all those companies end up needing to do a bunch of layoffs, 30% plus staff reductions, either in 1 or 2 waves. It's like, I think being a little bit more principled and having the courage to not do that was very smart, and probably part of why you're not needing to do layoffs and everything now. You can sort of incrementally respond to stuff more reasonably because you didn't bow to any pressure to increase headcount way faster than you should have. If you look at the numbers from the crazy FANG phase at the end of this thing, it was bananas. Like the way that Facebook and some of these others just mushroomed their teams, like 2019 to 22 or whatever, was just totally bonkers. You look at this stuff and you're like, what the fuck? Like, why did this, what are you thinking? And it's just like people go into these frenzies and they're not thinking. That's the answer. The answer to what are you thinking is fucking nothing, right? Because you're just reacting. You're just reacting out of emotion and FOMO and stuff, and not You're not reasoning from first principles about why you're doing this and why are these people really needed and what economics support this. Like what would need to happen for this to, make sense and for us to double down on this? What would need to happen for us to need to roll this back? Like none of that was being asked. And so sure enough, it all had to be rolled back like this. And I think we're
and now we're in
not
it.
even at the end of it.
Yeah,
We're not even at the end
yeah,
of it. Right.
yeah. But
So
I agree with that. I do think I guess my my steel man or my argument in favor of your friends would be some version of exactly what you said, the pressures from the board, like when all the incentives in your ecosystem are on top line growth and nothing else,
yeah,
right?
exactly.
On one
Yeah.
hand, there's an excessive amount of capital, right? And then in certain industries, there's at least a perception of a window. Like there's a window of opportunity. Like if we don't take the market in the next
Yeah.
18 months,
That was
2
always the
years,
argument.
3
Yeah.
years, right? We're gone. We're gone. So
That
we
was
might
always
as
the
well
argument.
it's go big or go home. It's kind of
Mm-hmm.
the perception of whether that's true or not, but the
Mm-hmm.
perception of that.
Mm-hmm.
And then competitive dynamics, where your competitors might be
We're
using kind of
doing it. Yeah.
capital as a weapon,
Yep.
right? Which maybe we saw like in some Ubers and Lyft and whatever stuff like that, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you add those four factors together,
Yep.
that's a really strong maelstrom that it's hard for, I think, especially first-time founders to resist.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think that argument of the speed and there's this like narrow window we have to fly through, and these other guys are trying to fly through too, and like we just need to, put on the afterburners as hard as possible to see if we can get through there before them is sort of the argument. It's sort of like it's like FOMO on steroids, right? They just ramped it to like the max possible FOMO. It's like peak emotion FOMO that is like I think sort of fairly heavily VC driven. But it resulted in like you remember like stuff like the scooter category, which isn't even a thing. That was like right, that was one of these like we gotta all race to capture this market that doesn't actually fucking exist, and it just like manifested this temporary like strange market for it, and it was just like that was just super bizarre, right? Like books, there probably is already a book about the scooter thing. If not, there should be, but that's a fascinating one where it's just like the economics were just never really validated, at all, and it just became this super bizarre like ephemeral category, purely based on exactly what we're talking about, this maelstrom. Just so tell me about, as a first-time founder, first-time CEO. It's hard, right? And coming from a technical background, there's a bunch of stuff that in the beginning you kind of stink at, all of us. What have been some of your biggest challenges as a first-time CEO? And I mean, it's been good that you had, I think, some time to kind of grow into it at the beginning, but you seem quite business savvy now. Like, what did you feel that way in the beginning, or is that something that came in time? Like, I'd love to hear some of the biggest challenges in your growth path
Yeah,
as a CEO.
I've always found it easy to absorb kind of the theory of business that, probably like yourself, someone who's kind of steeped in maths and engineering and computer sciencey stuff. It's like the theoretical aspects of it aren't that hard if you're
No.
interested in it. And I was always interested in it. The challenges are always people, of course. Like how do you deal with the various people issues. Um, but even maybe more broadly, it's like I tend to get caught up in strategy. I love kind of formulating my 2 by 2 matrices and charting out, and I love kind of analyzing our market and trends in it and can talk forever about stuff like that. But that's not the real game. Like strategy is whatever, some very low single digit percent of success. Execution is the real game. That is what it's about, right? And that's probably where I've had to kind of work the hardest on myself, right? And grow the most, right? And I couldn't really translate like execution in my old profession as a hacker was like crisp thinking, being able to bang out code really fast that was maintainable and did the job. And, it is that, whereas execution for a company, it's much more about processes discipline, like a culture of accountability. It's just like it's a very different game from being good at execution as a coder, right? If you know what I mean. And so that's probably the biggest one, and one that I'm constantly struggling with, challenging myself on, because the game is different, right? Like when you're 20 people versus 200 people, we're 700 people now, right? It's then a different game, kind of the layers and just how you shape and affect the culture. Like it's a very different game, right? So I'm kind of constantly thinking about that one, but that probably would be the biggest challenge,
Yeah, and I
over
think
the last 10 years.
and I think with execution as a CEO, you're really driving execution. You're not executing anything. You're driving execution in the
That's right.
organization,
Yeah, you're
and
ensuring
that's
that execution happens.
yeah, yeah, and that's very, very hard, and especially like I think driving accountability and having the feedback loop that sort of puts accountability in place always is hard because that's where you hit the rubber meets the road, right? And you need to fire people or switch them out of their roles, or you it's when shit's working, it's working. There's like not a lot to do, right? That's awesome when it happens. But a lot of the times, like shit isn't working, right? And you've got to
Yeah.
do something about it.
Well, and the stuff that was working in a previous stage, or in fact that was the reason you got to the previous stage,
Yeah,
might be the completely wrong thing to do in your new stage,
right. Yeah,
right?
totally. Yep.
And so there's a ton of that. It's like, wait, 180 degree, and it kind of your head spins for a while, and your entire muscle memory is wrong because you've actually step function changed into a new dimension, and
Yeah.
gravity. So shit doesn't drop. Now shit falls sideways here. It's like, oh, okay.
Yeah.
So then you have to
Right.
figure that out, and it's kind of like
Yeah,
with kids.
totally.
The moment you figure out a new face, they evolve into a different one, right? And
Yeah.
it's actually that type of a thing. But that's why the learning curve for a like a founder CEO at a high growth startup, it's a vertical learning curve. That's
Yeah.
part of why what makes the job so fascinating too.
Yeah, it's fun and interesting and very challenging, right? Like what so people, you mentioned people issues. What have been, some of the top couple people challenges so far? Has it been growing organizations that you didn't know anything about initially, like sales or whatever, or has it been hard organizational changes where you have to get rid of people or groups that aren't functioning? Like what's been most challenging?
Yeah, it's probably been more the latter, right?
Mm.
I felt like org design comes reasonably natural to me, like how should I structure
Yeah.
the company, but
Yeah.
like processes, I'm not really a process guy, and in
Yeah.
particular, not with. I mean, I was probably that on the engineering side back in the days. I kind of I like that. I was never like amazingly good at it, but you know, but then for all these different disciplines that I've just never done, right? Like that's so okay. So then, how do we institute like a regular cadence of operating reviews, and like who should own that, right? And like and just like individual things too. Like I'm good in like an individual meeting to drive to kind of clarity on, all right, so what are we saying here? Like we want to do XYZ, and who owns X and Y and Z? Is that you, Joe, and you, Jane? Are you the owners of that? Is that what I'm hearing? I'm good at that kind of stuff. And then I'm terrible at remembering it. Then I move on to the next conversation, and in the best of worlds, Joe and Jane would remember that, have the same view as I do, and then we have another meeting 3 weeks later. They've delivered on that. But that's not how things work at scale. Like when you're 10 people, that's how things work, right? Otherwise, you go out of business, right? But at scale, that's not how things work because there's so many competing priorities and misunderstandings and stuff like that. So then you have to have a system for recording stuff like that and remembering that until that follow-up meeting 3 weeks from now, right? And so instituting stuff like that, that has been kind of some of the hardest stuff. But then also, like to your question, just some of those people decisions where you have people who have been fantastic in the past, right? Who are great, accomplished, amazing people, highly talented, who kind of Steve Jobs bleed in five collars type of a thing. They're so passionate about neo4j and what we do, right? But they're not the right fit right now for the next stage for the company, right? And you know it, right? They might not and they might disagree with even that, right? And then making those decisions, having those conversations, man, that's not fun. But ultimately, that's what you have to do. Otherwise, you're mistreating the people who are the right fit, right? Because ultimately, your obligation is to the company and to all the stakeholders of that company, shareholders, customers, partners, employees, right? That is what your where your loyalty has to lie as a CEO. So you have to
Yeah.
have those conversations. But
Yeah.
that those have been some of the most challenging parts.
And I think what I've learned over the years too is like ultimately that person isn't served by, fighting to the death either, right? Like that you don't leaving them there failing or no, already and knowing that it's just going to keep getting worse, just because you're afraid of conflict, is kind of a weak ass move, right, from a leader if you think about it. It took me a while to see it that way because but you have to empathize with their position too and realize like, yeah, if they are failing and it's going to get worse and they're not necessarily seeing it, it's way worse for them to let them continue in that situation, right? It's like you have to at some point, it's almost like coming into more of like a fatherly kind of view on stuff. It's like, I'm not going to let one of my kiddos actually hurt themselves, right? They can play around with this toy and be silly and it's funny and stuff, but not if it comes to the point where they're actually going to cut their hand off. Then it's like, no, daddy's going to take that away. I'm not going to let you cut off your hand. There has to come a point where you need to be able to see stuff at a higher level like that and stop people from cutting off their own hand. And usually it's better and they'll find themselves way happier in a different role later on, whether it's at your company or someplace else, and they'll realize, okay, like I'm glad I'm not in that situation where I was failing, even if they don't see it in the moment. I've had multiple people that I circle back with, 1-2 years on, that kind of see it the same, like in hindsight. And anytime I've allowed it to drag on too long, you always regret it. They always regret it. It destroys relationships entirely. So that's kind of a funny thing, is that like you can fire someone in a humane way that's stopping them from hurting themselves and the company, and do it amicably, even if they're grumpy about it, and have a very positive relationship 1 year, 2 years down the line. You could let that same person fight themselves to the death until they see it's failing and then never speak to them again forever, because like you just allowed too much damage to be done, right? It's like a relationship that got too far out of hand and you can't even be friends anymore because there was just too much fighting or whatever, right? It gets
Yeah,
bad.
and I think that's right, and kind of the model that has worked really well for me is kind of the Kim Scott radical candor type
Yeah.
thing, right? Where it's like
Yeah.
you have to, because I'm an empath, right? And I just need to remind myself that my job is to be long-term kind to this person who I genuinely care about, right? And so that long-term kindness means sometimes short-term doing things that is going to be painful and
Yes.
awkward and feel really, really terrible for that individual and for me too, right? But it's the right thing to do for the long term, and that goes for giving feedback, right?
Mm-hmm.
To also saying, hey, you know what? Like it's not working out. Let's find a great job for you elsewhere. That type
Yeah.
of a thing.
So give me your top like one or two, and this is my last question. So I always like to talk about failing and what we learn from failure, because I think as CEOs there's no precursor to what we do. You learn a lot of it on the job, and so by definition we kind of have to fail a lot. And we all usually have funny stories about things that we've failed at that we've learned from. So can you give me a top one or two fails that you've had over the years and what you've learned from
Yeah, there's plenty to choose from, right?
them? We all
But
have them.
but
We all have them.
yeah, but maybe I kind of circle back with some of the things that we've talked about. We've talked about structuring the go to market and open source and like a community edition and open core and SaaS service and, that kind of a stuff, right? And so I'll circle back to kind of early era, like my biggest failure back in the days, which was um, when we started out, we had this I think some amount of clarity around how we wanted to go to market, which is what I talked about before, win the hearts and minds of developers, right? And then through that, get infiltrate the enterprise, right? And then sell into it with normal enterprise sales motions, right? So that's kind of how we thought about it, right? When we raised our Series A, we were 14 people, myself. I just hired a sales-oriented COO, right? Maybe an admin or two, and the rest are engineers, right? So 10, 11 engineers, right? A year later, we were 50 people in the company, still 10 to 11 engineers. And this is not because we had a product that the narrative that we told ourselves internally was, hey, we can hit our numbers for the next year or two, right? With exactly this product. Yes, of course, we always have to invest in the product, but we don't need to balloon the engineering team right now because this product is good enough to sell for now, right? That type of a thing, right? Well, that was accurate in the small, but in the big, though, the real game with a B2D, with a developer first, hearts and minds of developers go to market strategy is it's a UX game. It's a DX specifically game, a developer experience.
Yeah, exactly.
Right? And so back in the days when you played around with us, we were probably like an embedded Java library. I don't remember exactly what year, but we were, and we had maybe this HTTP REST API type of a thing. We're just like, man, it worked, but it was very awkward, right? And so there's a lot of work we could have done in making, polishing the developer experience of our product, which we've mentioned Mongo several times on this podcast. That was their big brilliance, right?
Yes.
Look, I'm not going to sit there. I'm a big fan of Mongo. I'm not going to sit there and argue how their storage engine is amazing or their internals or their whatever, their single write lock. And there's a ton of internals that, we can debate. Yeah. But their developer experience, freaking amazing.
Was awesome.
It was always very good, right?
It was awesome.
And so what happened there was, coming back to the biggest failure, in the early days, was we had a strategy, which was win the hearts and minds of developer. That was the strategy. But we resourced the company like a classic enterprise sales go-to-market machinery.
Yeah.
And so there was an orthogonal thing going. There's a strategy resourcing mismatch, right?
Totally.
It's not that one is better than the other. I could have said, hey, let's not go to market. Let's go to market classic top-down sales enterprise. That's valid, right? But what isn't valid is have a strategy pointing in one direction and resource the company in the other.
Right. Yeah.
Right. That probably set us back 2 to 3 years easily.
I see. That makes sense. Did you have to get rid of people and do any layoffs at that point, or did you basically had to catch up the other piece that you had?
We had to catch up. Yeah,
you had underinvested.
Yeah, we had to catch up.
Yeah,
it took a long time before we did that
to rebalance. You basically. I see. Yeah. Interesting one. Yeah, that's I think so important to really understand in a deeper way, how am I going to market, and make sure that you don't scale the company up in the wrong way as you start scaling that up, which I think is very normal actually to kind of screw up. And there's many different vectors along which you can screw that up. It's not only this developer oriented versus enterprise. There's many other ways, in terms of thinking about marketing versus selling and all kinds of different things. So it's
different geographies. There's all kinds of enterprise, mid-market, self-serve, there's
what
so
kind of
many
product what
vectors
kind of product am I trying to sell, really? That's another one that I've had a
horizontal versus vertical, solutions versus platform.
Yeah, totally. And you get some, if you view your business in a certain way, then you'll see another business as being analogous to it and think that you're going to get a person as a key leader from that business and they're going to be exactly the right fit. And then it turns out, no, they're not a fit at all. And it turns out that was just kind of a shitty analogy. It's sort of true, but not really, you know, and then down in the rubber meets the road where you actually are running out a sales process and stuff. You're realizing, oh, wow, yeah, this is like really different. You know, I had a company once that I thought looked like a lot like another company that we hired several key executives from. And it turned out that that was a much more of like a consultative type of a sell where there was a piece of underlying tech, but ultimately there was quite a bit of like consulting and also internal work where they were building something on top of the tech internally in the customer. Whereas this was much more like straight up just like use the software, right? Like not do any of that. And it just created like so much weird friction, and like the whole way of customer success and so on was way different. You know, I had a guy trying to build an army of forward deployed engineer type people going in there into the customer and running these giant gigs. And I'm like, fuck, what is that? What's happening? This is a massive amount of friction. Like this isn't supposed to be what we're doing. And you just realize, oh shit, like I completely, you know, some of the components of the technology were the same. Some of the customer segments and so on were the same. But ultimately, like in reality, it was a very different product, very different sell, very different like rollout, and end up being like a really bad match. And there's just so many different ways you can kind of screw that up. And I guess as long as you catch it before it gets too far away from you, because you can't.
That's the key.
You know,
nail
you can't,
it, then you scale it.
Yeah.
First nail it,
Yeah.
then scale it.
Exactly.
That's the model.
You got to get yourself. You have to give yourself space to hit the reset button if it's not working, because if it isn't working and you've gone too far with it, you know, and you need to do these big layoffs and reorgs and stuff, and you're a small startup like 20 to 75 people or whatever, you can't hit reset like that, you know, 4 or 5 times. You kind of get like one of those, maybe 2. And so you can't be wrong like multiple times, really. Like, you know, you get wrong like that, and it's like that's a do or die moment right there for the company. Like if you don't sort of correct it, like I'm not even sure if I've seen somebody get a third chance. I think you kind of only get a second chance at that one. Like if you have to try to pivot it twice, I don't know. I'm racking my brain. I'm not thinking of one where I've seen that work. I've seen it happen once, and most of the time, even once, like it doesn't work. So I think yours was not that bad because you were just like off, but not like deeply wrong. So it's not like you needed to nuke all that whole other part.
No, we were able to grow into it.
Yeah, exactly. So I think that's really nice. That's better. Like if those were like also the totally wrong kinds of people on the commercial side, then that'd have been like potentially a company killer, because it could have been too much for you to shift, right? But anyways, it's always fun to talk through these things and think about what we've learned from all the stuff we've screwed up along the way. And the good news is, you know, when you do it at smaller scale, hopefully now you're not doing it at current scale as much, right? So that's
I'm making
good.
new mistakes now.
Yeah, exactly. And hopefully, you know, ones that are like incrementally a little bit smaller, you know.
That's right.
So you're not really necessarily taking this like company level risk, you know, at the large scale. You know, you can kind of get those kind of more egregious errors out of your system when it's like smaller.
When you're tiny.
Yeah, exactly. Right. Okay, cool, man. This was really a lot of fun. Thank you so much for taking the time.
Fantastic. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, man. Okay, see you later. Have a good one.